check this out. Last minute audible, Markus, who was going to be joining us on the panel. If you don't know Markus, Propeller Heads is a really dope shop. Check them out. They're really cool. So I want to plug Markus and not just totally rug this opportunity from him. But we got Jacques from Evmos, who's coming in, filling in last minute. Thank you so much, Jacques. And thank you all for being here and coming around to hang out and talk about intents with us. If you were in the earlier keynote that Dean gave, there was a question by an audience member, a really, really good question, about what is the relationship between intents and chain abstraction. Dean gave a really, really good answer that I'm not smart enough to summarize, but we've got this awesome panel of experts and Jacques here who are going thanks, Jacques. We got an awesome panel here. We're going to dive into intents and how they can actually help enable chain abstraction, and in general, what intents are and how they are impacting Web3 landscape overall. All right. So just to kind of get everyone on the same page, I'm going to put out at least what I think is a pretty solid generic definition of an intent, and everyone is welcome to refute that or not. After I define that, I'm going to let each panelist introduce themselves and their project, and then tell me how close my definition of an intent was. So generally, an intent, as it applies to crypto and application development, it's a high-level, user-defined goal that specifies a desired outcome as opposed to a description of technical steps. So buy an NFT is closer to an intent than send tokens via CCTP, for example. Nobody wakes up and says, I can't wait to use CCTP today. Maybe I'm wrong. And with that said, panelists, please introduce yourselves, let us know what project you're working with, and how wrong my definition is.
Do you want me to start?
Right, let's go.
Whoa. Hi, I'm Arjun. I'm one of the founders of Everclear. Everclear is the first clearing layer. It's a new primitive that we've introduced. It's very fundamental to intents. You may have known us by our previous name, however, which is Connext. We are a project that has been working with intents for a while. We were actually the first intent-based bridge back in 2021. And then with Everclear, we're working to solve some of the core problems that are associated with intent-based protocols, which is now just about every bridge. And really one of the biggest problems being, how do intent solvers manage inventories? How can you make solving accessible to everybody?
Awesome.
Oh, and then your definition. I think it's a great definition. I think I think another helpful analogy could be, is that I tend to use a lot and seems to resonate, is Uber. Uber is a fantastic intent protocol. You basically tell Uber, I want to get to this place, and then Uber is like, okay, I'm going to figure out how to get you there as fast and as quickly and cheaply as possible, and you're not necessarily specifying, I want to use this driver, or I want my car to be like this, or I want to take this pathway.
Awesome. Hey everyone, my name is Khushi. I lead research at Aethos, where we're building a programmable policy layer. And so basically what that means is that application developers can create policies, which is a set of rules, constraints, conditional expressions, whatever you want to call it, for their application. And that determines what kinds of wallet addresses can interact with their application. We mostly focus on risk management, so that includes exploit prevention, anomaly detection, OFAC compliance, and things of that sort. In terms of the intent definition, I do think I agree with it for the most part. The one thing is, we focus on constraints as a company. And so I think one really, really important part of intents that's underexplored is how users can express constraints on their intents in a way such that it isn't an additional pressure on the user, but still allows them to have some control over the actual execution of the intent.
Those were very good introductions. My name's Apriori. I work on Anoma. Anoma is a distributed operating system for intents. In simple terms, it allows users to express what they want in terms of intents instead of transactions, and it allows developers to write applications in terms of intents instead of transactions. The protocol provides different affordances like heterogeneous trusts, information flow control, and intent level composability, among other things. In terms of the definition that you gave, I think that was quite reasonable. I mean, how we think about intents, intents are credible commitments to preferences and constraints over possible state transitions, maybe a little bit more technical, but in terms of how we define them in protocol, I think it's a bit more precise, or atomic information flow constraints could be another one, or one that I heard yesterday was predicates over state. Again, I think these are all kind of going in the same direction. So.
Hi, Jack. Not an expert on intents. Work at Evmos PD. So we do a lot of chain abstraction. What we want to do is provide an EVM interface into the Cosmos space. That's one of the barriers trying to solve because a lot of developers, the code base is based on Solidity. To rewrite your code base in another language, you inherit the security. You don't inherit the security guarantees with a battle tested code base. So what we try to do is, again, in the Cosmos space where there's so many different blockchains, and to develop one application that works for all of these chains is a difficulty. So we abstract away in the form of an EVM. So developers deploy this EVM smart contracts and have it work across the Cosmos chains. So that's more chain abstraction, but obviously we also look at the user experience side of things. And for me, intent is basically like, what does the user want to do? It shouldn't require the user to think about what kind of wallet, maybe even what kind of application. Maybe I just want to lend all my assets. And if I could just do that and have the system find the best interest rate for my assets, that's great. But I don't want to have to worry about, like MetaMask. I don't want to have to worry about bridging. I don't want to have to worry about these things. And that's what, for me, intent solves, is what the user wants to do and how we get there as easily as possible.
For a random audience poll, that was pretty good, right? It's awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for that. I know I wanted to dive into right off the bat, what is the relationship between intents and chain abstraction? But I think there's one additional piece of context that could actually be pretty valuable here. And why are intents even a thing? Like this is like a new emergent property in Web3, and there's a lot of momentum and interest behind it. What was sort of the conditions that primed us to be receptive to intent-based systems, and why is there so much motivation? What does success here mean for us?
I feel like that's a question for you.
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions in there. How did intent start? I mean, there's a lot of history, right? I mean, I think like even if you look at something like the Agoric papers, or you look at the Wyvern protocol, if you look at some of the early bridging protocols like Connects. I mean, like people have been thinking about this concept for some time. I'd say from our perspective, we've been thinking about it since about 2020 in terms of like concrete protocol for intents. If you think of like what an intent is, like the OG intent system is like language. You kind of say what you want and the person responds to you based off of that. There's also like body language involved as well. In terms of what does success for these systems look like, I mean, I think we're seeing a lot of success already today with swap-based intents. If you look at things like CowSwap, again, if you look at bridging protocols like Across, I mean, these are very simple types of intents, but still you can see how there could be a progression to something like modular logistics, like an Uber, where a user can just express what they want. I mean, even if you look at like Apple's new architecture, they have like an intent module in there. So clearly like there's some memetics around the term as well, which is helpful beyond our industry.
I think going back to like why I first got into intents, it was probably with the idea of a user focus in mind, which is what a lot of people look at it at now. Like crypto user experience was very difficult. You had to know a lot before you could do even a simple transaction on chain. And I think the idea is to make it a little bit easier for users to onboard onto crypto so that they don't have to know as much in order to get to the same end state. And so it's supposed to help improve user experience, but I do think we still struggle with the chicken and the egg problem where we don't really have users or applications yet. So we're solving the infrastructure side, but we still need to solve the other side of that equation before we get anywhere.
Yeah, these are fantastic answers. I guess to try to like build on top of this a little bit, like crypto had its roots in like peer-to-peer systems, like negotiating relationships with other people on a direct one-to-one basis. And then we sort of transitioned away from that towards like blockchains as consensus engines where you have like an end-party relationship and everybody's agreeing on the same state because of things like reliability. And I think like it made a lot of sense, right? Like blockchains were a truly incredible innovation. But then I think we've overfit a little bit as well, where we were like, okay, let's use a blockchain for everything, right? Like let's put everything on chain. And the reality is that the right kind of topology, the right outcome is like a combination of the two, where you need to have, you know, as you guys mentioned, like there's like a lot of complexity inherent to what the on-chain world today looks like. A really simple example of this is Uniswap. Like Uniswap v2 was like on-chain contracts. You called like a simple swap function. You didn't need to provide any data, and you were able to swap for tokens. Uniswap v3 requires off-chain routing data. That's a total paradigm shift, right? If you're trying to compose into building with Uniswap v3, you can't fundamentally as an application. You have to like go and fetch off-chain data to do that. Who is going to go and fetch that off-chain data? So what's basically happened is that this space is just like as the space has become more sophisticated, the amount of context you need to interact with applications, the amount of context you need about the chain state for both the chain you're on and then also other chains has just grown. And so we need a way to resolve that. We sort of like need to add a gap between what the user is doing, which is just like wanting to use an app, and what the chain needs, which is all of this other off-chain contextual information. And that off-chain peer-to-peer layer, that is intense.
That makes perfect sense. And I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, overfitting and trying to put everything on a blockchain. I mean, that doesn't sound like our industry at all. Nobody does that. But we've talked a lot about how intents are really good for the users and sort of the end result of what happens when we have these intent-based systems. But how much does it make things easier or more difficult for the developers? Like from a developer perspective, are these applications harder to build?
Yeah, one way to think about intents is like, what you're effectively doing is offloading, like you're kind of offloading all of the complexity to a service provider, right? And like the great thing about offloading complexity to service providers is that they can, instead of having to do like domain-specific stuff for like a custom thing you want to have to do every single time you do it, the service provider can just do that at scale, right? It's the same as like, you know, why you go and like fetch data from an API instead of having to like a weather API instead of having to like go and like figure it out from like lower level geological information all the time, right? Like it's just easier. There's like economies of scale you get by just doing the same thing over and over again as a business. And that's effectively what like intents are doing is like you're offloading this complexity to the solvers who can go and be domain specialized businesses on one specific topic or one specific route or one specific thing. And so for developers, this is a form of abstraction. It's a form of like complexity reduction, right? Where as a dev, you're not having to go and figure out, okay, how do I optimally route through Uniswap? How do I optimally route through like these aggregators? You're just like, I just want to get there. Someone else figure it out.
And he brought it back to abstraction. It's almost like we planned this, but that really brought us right to the relationship between intents and chain abstraction. And in particular, like Khushi, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this because you're a very specific form of an intents implementation focused on policy, which is, seems very much more on like the business logic side of things. So how did you guys approach intents and sort of arrive at that as the conclusion for like a model for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think going back to a little bit of your previous question as well, like does like using intent-based systems make it harder for the developer? And I think it does to a certain extent. Like I absolutely think we're abstracting away the complexity of execution, which is convenient because you have all these other elements of the system, and that part makes it easier for the developer. But at the same time, developers now have to be a lot more opinionated about the way that they're building their system. So if they're abstracting things away from the user, they're now making a lot more decisions on their end about how they want their application to function. And I think we'll see a lot of front-end fragmentation because we'll see different front-ends specialized for different things because those developers are all taking opinionated choices about what their front-end enables. So you'll see front-ends that are very, very focused on security, and they'll make sure that their system abstracts away the actual details of that security, but they ensure that those intents are executed in a secure fashion. Whereas other front ends will be very, very focused on having the best price execution or the fastest execution. And so you'll see users able to make choices of their own, but it'll be based on the application that they choose to interact with, and those applications will be making the actual transaction details and those decisions. So I think it's like developer complexity increases slightly, but it's not in terms of like a ton of coding complexity once we have nice standards for intents, but I think it's more around the idea that now you have to be opinionated about the application you're building and how you want to build it and the types of users you want to serve. And so that's why we focus very much on those constraints, because those actually define the types of execution that users will receive at the end of the day.
You mentioned standards. Is there any work being done around developing some intent standards? Like who's working on that? Does it seem promising?
Yeah, I mean, one standard that I know of is the one being developed by Across and Uniswap in collaboration. Like that's a standard being developed for cross-chain intents, which I think is a standard that a lot of people are looking into. But I think there's other standards out there as well, if anyone wants to speak on those.
So I think in terms of standards, they're always a little bit tricky because you can make a standard and it doesn't necessarily mean folks will adopt it. So I'll give you a concrete example of this. If you look at the inter-blockchain communication protocol, it's a great standard for interoperability. It has some drawbacks, but at the same time, it is like quite neutral and it does give you trust minimization when you're moving funds between chains. And unfortunately, or fortunately, for lack of a better term, not everybody in the industry has adopted this standard because there are certain needs that different protocols and different architectures have. And these are like path-dependent decisions, right? So like Ethereum block times are 12 seconds, and it takes 13 minutes for the Gasper protocol to finalize a block. So you're not going to get this single slot finality where you can relay IBC headers, right? And roll-up sequencers, for the most part, can't give you this guarantee either because you have to also wait for the optimistic fraud-proof window to close, or you need to wait for a succinct zero-knowledge proof to be generated to get finality, or at least a confirmation rule that is acceptable for you. And so I think there will be a lot of competing standards, just like there are a lot of competing stacks that you're seeing, like in the roll-up space, whether it's like the OP stack or Sovereign SDK or something like this. But ultimately, I think that the standards that are the most interoperable and compatible with others are going to be the ones that probably wind up having some staying power over time. It's very hard to say right now what that's going to look like. I think things like ERC 7638, if I'm quoting it right, is very interesting, and I think it definitely has some support within the community. So I'd be looking forward to seeing folks actually like adopting that and coordinating around that standard.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent some time thinking about like what makes a standard adoptable in this space, and it's difficult because like, you know, like the unfortunate reality of this space is that like people's intentions have sort of ended up becoming obfuscated because of bags, and like even if your intentions are actually good, like there's always the risk of bag bias, and so there's like people just assume that there are potentially malicious intentions with things like standards. And so I feel like something that I've sort of started to see is that the things that seem to be getting adoption are when you can find a standard that is like effectively helping to like where you can take like a problem space like chain abstraction, right? And you can identify what are the different problems associated with that problem space. Mm-hmm. So for example, you know, unifying balances and like, you know, the permissioning aspect of chain abstraction is one part of the problem. Then there's like solving and like who is actually running those solvers, how are they operating, things like that is another part of the problem. How do you select solvers is another part of the problem, right? And so I think what I've started to see happening, and I really like this, is like differentiating problem spaces and like differentiating as an organization towards like what specific problem you're solving, and having people self-identify into like a layers of a stack, like the chain abstraction stack, for instance, seems to work really well with standards if you can make the standards just the interfaces between the layers of the stack. Right, because those interfaces everybody's aligned on adopting. Because like if you are building a solver network, right, you don't want to have to go and do 15 integrations into a bunch of like order flow sources because they all have different interfaces. If you are a underlying transport protocol, you don't want to have to go and you don't have to go and work with independent solvers just like one by one. Solvers don't want to have to go and build in-house aggregators to work with every single like bridge and mechanism under the hood. And so I think that's maybe like one of the promising areas that I hope more standards can get built in. And yeah, as you guys mentioned, like 7683 or whatever, that one is falls into that category. So I'm pretty optimistic about it.
So you heard it here. There's a free good idea in case anyone wants to go build a standard. We'll let you guys have that one for free. So it seems like implementing intent-based systems will ultimately do a lot to help facilitate a lot of this like interoperability between different applications and chains and everything. What are some of the technical challenges that are preventing people now or teams now, projects who have applications who aren't currently leveraging any sort of intent-based system, who are saying like, yes, I do believe this is the direction things are going. How do they start to pivot that way and start thinking about that?
For cross-chain specifically, there's one very interesting paradigm that has emerged over the course of the last few years, which is like the absolutely idiotic strategy of like copy pasting your application to every chain and then like bootstrapping TVL into every single one, and then you end up with like 11 instances of Aave with like whatever $10 billion spread across them on like 11 different chains. And like, look, like it makes sense that we ended up there, right? Like there was no other solution. You needed to be able to expand to these different ecosystems, but at the same time, this is a strictly inferior outcome, right? You are fragmenting your liquidity. If you're Aave, you're just not able to have as much size because you've moved. You can't possibly like organize liquidity on all these different chains. I think this is changing. Like the app chain narrative is pretty strong, and like everybody wants to be a chain, and it's like this is one of the weird cases where like I'm kind of like, okay, like I get the like pumpamentals and like VC whatever of everybody wants to launch a chain, but I think in this case it actually makes sense. It's like move all of your infrastructure, move all of your liquidity to its own isolated environment, keep it all consolidated, and just make it easy to access from anywhere. I think that's one of the big challenges today, is like applications just are not operating that way. They're not thinking about onboarding users that way. They're starting to realize like, hey, onboarding from every ecosystem is actually a better strategy, which in retrospect is very obvious, but the material aspect of how they will do that, where they will onboard to, especially if they're already fragmented, is an interesting and open question.
RIP the 82 DAI I have stuck in Aave V1 that costs $350 to withdraw. Case in point.
Yeah.
Any other comments on challenges that teams are going to face if they're trying to move into an intent-based system, either from like a business perspective or from just a technology perspective?
Just want to piggyback right off. Like Aave, for example, right? They do have to deploy on 16 different chains. So, but that's not even like the issue. The issue is that your wallet doesn't know which chain you want to interact with. It's a very basic problem. So like trying to talk to Aave is like, hey, do you want to deploy another chain? It's like, yes. And also for them, their core business is ETH. 94% of their revenue is from ETH, and the other 5% is from stablecoins. So like that's 99% of their revenue. For them to move out of that ecosystem, you need to do a lot more. And I don't know, like chain abstraction, I think, is better for building more bow applications, like truly cross-chain applications. Like you could have eigenlayer as a security layer, and then you could do like data availability on Celestia, and then you want your applications to work on Arbitrum or something. I don't know, some weird stuff where you have like multiple systems working together. And then intent for me is abstracting that way for developers and the users. Because if you don't have the tool sets for building multi-chain, which we don't have today, think about it, like what kind of SDK can you use to build like a modular chain? It's nothing, right? So you have to solve for that, and you have to solve for the user experience. We just don't have wallets that just like knows how to figure out what chain you want to connect to, which is ridiculous. Yeah, I don't know, it's crazy. We live in a crazy user experience space.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone here remembers like what using the internet was like in like the early 90s. But basically like before really the World Wide Web became a thing, the internet was a bit of a shit show. Like you had to manually telnet to other networks, which means you had to manually basically figure out where your network is in the internet, your like home network, and then you have to connect to someone else's home network to like route to their network manually, and then you have to go and get files from their network and then bring them back. And like the web was just an abstraction over all of this, right? HTTP was an abstraction over all of this, where it was like, okay, let's have a version of the internet where you don't have to go and manually connect to other people's networks, where all of that is just behind the scenes. It's all obfuscated behind a domain. And what you do is you go to this website, and like it just serves you content. It just gives you what you want. And that was just revolutionary, right? Like the internet went from being like 50 to 100 people running hobbyist stuff to being suddenly like thousands and thousands and thousands of sites pretty much overnight.
That sounds awesome.
You don't think IBC could be that though?
IBC, I think, is lower level in the stack. So like,
Yeah.
I think this is part of the challenge that we've run into historically is that we've kind of like, when we've talked about cross-chain, we've been treating it as like one singular problem. But it's not really, right? It's like, there's separate problems here. There's problems of how do you get data from one chain to another, which is what IBC solves.
How do you
then there's
verify
how do you
that data?
secure that data, which is actually different depending on what chain you're on. And that a lot of different projects or a lot of different ecosystems are trying to solve. And then there's the third question of like, well, how do you make it cheap and fast and easy to use? And because when you do make it secure, and this is not as much of a problem for the IBC ecosystem just because like, there's not as much like, you're not paying as much yet for security. There's not as much demand for block space yet there. But like when you're talking about like a ZK Lite client, for instance, right? That is going to cost money. Like ZK Lite clients are going to cost like millions and millions of dollars to run. Users are not going to pay like $15 to $20 a transaction. Like that, and so the abstraction here is similar to HTTP. Like you have users interact with intents, and then the intent solvers go and do one singular batch transaction through the Lite client because they can, like encompass thousands, tens of thousands of transactions, and that they're earning fees on.
Awesome. All right, we got 1 minute left, so I'm going to give each panelist 1 second, or just a couple of seconds to give us an idea of like what's something that you're excited about in the intent space, either an opportunity that you think is reachable via intent space systems, or something that your project is working on that you're coming up that you've got really excited about.
Yes, I'll take a moment to shamelessly shill. We have some novel intent-based applications that things like intent-centric Kickstarter, things like Promise Graph, which allows you to make service commitments internally in organizations, but also between organizations. Things like multi-chat, which is an encrypted Slack-like network that runs with Anoma on the back end. And also things like time banks or mutual credit networks enabled by this primitive that we call kudos or scale-free money. So I think there's a lot of applications that you can build with intents. And if you have a network that can take these intents and do stuff with them, you can rebuild a lot of the applications that we have in Web 2 today actually in Web 3 and make them decentralized and verifiable.
I'm definitely excited about those applications. I think one other thing I'm excited about is like there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered about chain abstraction broadly. Things that are beyond the technical, but more about the scope of what do users need out of chain abstraction? What kinds of things do they still need control over, or at least some ability to control? And I think those are some thought spaces that have a lot of development to do, and I'm really excited to see what comes out of those.
Yeah, I mean, from a philosophical standpoint, I'm really excited about like new ways of coordinating that open up as a result of intent. So like mutualism, like mutualist types of economic systems, collectivist economic systems. These are economic ideas that are like not part of the current metagame of highly inflationary economies. Basically, you won't find anything about this after like World War II. But if you look back into like how people have coordinated before that, like there's very, very awesome sustainable economic paradigms that have existed for like thousands of years that we just don't, that we can now like build at a very low cost and scale. On a more practical, down to earth perspective, I think like I started working in the space in like 2016, and like at that time we were talking about like, okay, how are we going to make it so users don't have to pay gas, so that they don't have to think about accounts, so that they don't have to like deal with like onboarding and many chains and things like that. And it's like it's crazy that it's taken us this long, but we are actually now very close to solving this problem. And I think that is to me extremely exciting, because it means like at least I get to finally stop doing this stuff and go build really cool stuff on top of blockchains, like which we all really want to do.
Yeah, so for me, our thesis is that there's going to be blockchains for everything. And hopefully IBC will be the glue that glues together, and EVM is the interface. So for us, we see everything could be rebuilt on blockchain systems, and again, making these systems work together and making it abstracting away from user. That's the biggest thing I want to. Like, I want Uber to run on a blockchain. I want Eventbrite. I want everything. All the internet systems that are now controlled by, a few engineers in Silicon Valley, and a few VCs. No, that's not what we're here for. Right? We're here to rebuild these systems to be decentralized and power back to the people. But we're a long way from that because of the fragmentation issues in technology and liquidity, and intents could be the solution to that. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for this super deep dive into intents, one of the coolest new mechanisms coming up in the crypto space. Definitely keep your ears out for everything coming out from these projects. There's a lot of neat, exciting work coming up in the intent space. And thank you, Jacques, for hopping up on stage literally as you walked in and joining the conversation.
Oh, this is great.
You did fantastic.
And yeah, I'm going to hand it over to my better looking counterpart, David, who will bring us on to our next part of our programming. Thank you all for coming.